So let's conclude this book with this last podcast, continuing on the idea of how the future of climate and health and food is going to be dealt with, or has to be dealt with. This is continuing with the idea of climate mitigation. I hope people are kind of broadly aware of these two concepts of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Mitigation is where we are trying to reduce emissions and other ways in which we contribute to climate change, land use change, for example, in addition to burning fossil fuels. Adaptation is considered what is trying to manage the unavoidable. So to the extent that extreme events are already here, impacts on health are already here, how do we adapt to dealing with the changes that are already happening? There is an overlap between mitigation and adaptation. They're not completely independent, but I hope you get the idea. Again, I have podcasts on that and the other courses that you can look up. So this is a nice paper in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, which looks at the so-called natural climate solutions and is looking at climate mitigation potential in 2030 in terms of petagrams carbon CO2 equivalent per year. And the colors here are maximum with safeguards. Basically, you have to worry about how reforestation, for example, will affect other livelihoods, land use, water, etc., etc. And the light gray color is something that can meet the 2 degrees C ambition by 2100 with 67% probability, and the darker colors are the low cost portion of the 2 degrees C ambitions, those that can be done kind of, let's say, a lower hanging fruit. Okay, because there is, under safeguards, you also have to worry about costs and zero sum games. For example, if you put a lot of money into planting 1 trillion trees, is that a silver bullet? And does that come at the cost of some other solution we could be adopting, and so on? Okay. Without going into too much detail, I wanted to just give you a sense of what are the things to be considered, and these also affect health. For example, reforestation, avoided forest conversion, natural forest management, improved plantations, avoided wood fuel, which is a great concern for many developing countries in terms of biomass burning and health impacts, indoor air quality, etc. Fire management, again, another disaster management. Under agriculture and grasslands, biochar, where the plant material is under high temperature, is converted into high carbon content, which can be sprayed on soils to improve carbon content, which improves soil structure, soil's moisture holding capacity, nutrient cycles, and so on and so forth. So you can see that they have certain mitigation potential of more than 1 petagram CO2 equivalent per year, which is important. Trees in croplands, so-called agroforestry, which is known to increase soil moisture persistence, drought resilience, carbon uptake by the soils, groundwater recharge, and so on and so forth. Soil water loss, nutrient management, grazing, conservation agriculture, improved rice. Rice cultivation is one of the largest methane emitters because of the flood irrigation, but there are ways in which it can be done without flooding the fields, which would reduce methane, which is 25 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2 when you consider a time period over which both will be contributing to global warming. Grazing, animal management, optimal legumes. So these are various different methodologies in which livestock can be managed. Avoided grassland conversion. Coastal restoration, so in wetlands, coastal restoration, peat restoration, avoided peat impacts and avoided coastal impacts. So these other co-benefits include air quality, biodiversity conservation, water conservation, groundwater recharge, and soil health, which improves crop yield as well. So you can see those benefits in each case here as well. Okay, so Obviously, each of these has positive impact on human health as well, which is not directly mentioned here, but we know that air quality and water quality are critical for human health. Just to kind of touch on adaptation and mitigation for climate as well. This is from Columbia University's Disaster Preparedness Center, and climate change, health, and disaster preparedness here is visualized as climate change driving here, rising temperatures, sea level rise, more extreme events, policy being part of the toolbox, climate adaptation and preparedness that we just talked about, health co-benefits, and policy effectiveness. So comes down to preparedness, response, and recovery for both health and disaster. COVID is a good example of how we need to have solid plans to recover from this really global disaster. So it includes research, policy, and practice. On the research side, health impacts, heat, vector-borne diseases, for example, waterborne diseases, air quality diseases, risk communication, vulnerabilities that we talked about, migration, resilience, forced migration, and migration for seeking new opportunities when climate makes life difficult. In practice, we need program development, risk communication strategies, training and education, and decision making. To look at it in a little bit more detail from this paper, climate change includes changes in average conditions, increased weather variability, changes in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, so heat waves, cold spells, heavy rainfall, storms, droughts. So environmental conditions create indirect exposure, social dynamics, food problems in terms of access, prices, shortages, hygiene, so socioeconomic status and health and nutrition status come in. That's where vulnerability is a good metric. Conflicts, displacements, and migration, community and family morale, social cohesion, anxiety problems, mental problems, psychological problems, and delivering health effects going from child development and infectious diseases to loss of productivity, cardiovascular, respiratory, mental illness, allergies, including death, injuries, poisoning, and drowning. Okay? How should sustainable development and climate actions map onto that? Migration in all mitigation in all sectors, including health, will help climate change. Environmental protection and regulation will help environmental conditions related to human well-being and health. Enhancing social resilience and equity makes climate justice, disparities of climate impacts can be dealt with. Just simply, for example, the Western industrialized countries have put out most of the carbon since Industrial Revolution, but the global south or the tropical belt is paying a heavier price. So how do we deal with this going forward? Public health adaptation, strengthening health systems, primary health care, warning systems, action plans and preparedness, monitoring and surveillance, integrating health in all policies. In fact, the COVID pandemic has exposed weaknesses in all these things, especially in warning systems, preparedness, primary health care, monitoring, surveillance, data sharing, vaccine access, and so on and so forth. So COVID is a good analogy for, in fact, how climate action will be tested. For example, economies have taken a great hit, and simple things like plastic use have exploded. And now when we come out of the COVID, hopefully soon, economic recovery will be a higher priority for all countries, especially developing countries like India, which have lost a lot of GDP and so on. So climate action is likely to take a back seat. And there are many examples of such unrelated events that distract us from climate action. But if we keep in mind that climate and health cannot be separated, then we can always remember that COVID was not just an economic problem, it was also a climate problem. Okay, so we have to develop solutions that going forward never drop climate action out of sight, no matter what else happens. Okay, so I will stop this book's podcasts here. I have a couple of other books I will use to cover other aspects of climate and health, which are also important. But this book gives us a good run through climate change over time, human evolution over the same period, and how health and human ecology has worked. Okay, hopefully these few podcasts help us get oriented to learn more of the climate and health in the traditional sense of how it is done. Okay.